Well, nuclear is possibly the most able to create large numbers of jobs. In terms of an operating nuclear power station, it is one of the safest ways of making electricity at scale.
Welcome to Bankable. I'm Doreen Abisundra, your host and a proponent of innovative technology and financing solutions for AI infrastructure, decarbonization, and energy security. So, Julia, welcome to the inaugural podcast of Season 2 in the Bankable podcast series. So delighted to have you here. Looking forward to hearing a little bit about who you are and very much about all the work that you have done within the energy nuclear infrastructure space. So over to you, Julia. Start us off very quickly by saying a little bit of who you are. What exactly brings Julia Pyke, this lady that we see on the screen, to us today?
I think people are often intrigued by how somebody who read English at university ends up running a nuclear power station project. And I'd say the first route is by doing law for a long time. So an awful lot of what happens in any UK infrastructure project is heavily based around law and process. I'm not advocating that there should be more of that. In fact, I think there should probably be less, but nonetheless, the fact is there's a lot. So I first started looking at nuclear in my capacity as a lawyer, where I did work for I was a bag carrier for the British Energy Privatisation a long time ago. That was my first acquaintance with nuclear. And then I did the legal work to form the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority in 2004-05, which was when new nuclear was very much sort of on life support. I think they had a policy called Keep the Nuclear Option Open. And then EDF decided to start investigating building Hinkley Point C, and I started work for them in round about 2006. So that shows you that there was then 10 years of doing an awful lot of legal work before Hinkley actually reached its final investment decision in September 2016. And after I'd done the law, and I think there were 400,000 pages of paper, I decided that from the mix of what I had done in my capacity as a lawyer, where I was the head of power at Herbert Smith Freehills, or now Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer, I had worked on a variety of projects, tidal lagoons, a tidal lagoon project, which didn't happen, various wind farms in the north of Scotland, including some initial work on the one in Shetland, Viking. I'd done work on the Drax biomass contract for difference conversions, and I'd worked on nuclear. And it seemed to me that there's a huge need for the UK to have more nuclear than just Hinkley Point C, and I decided to leave the law and go and work as the development director for Sizewell C, and then became the joint managing director. And I think that what my different background contributes is a more human-centered approach. You know, nobody's in any doubt that you need immense skill in nuclear engineering, in civil engineering, in all of the technical disciplines which are essential to safely building a nuclear power station and all the manufacturing that involves. But you do also need a perspective which understands how does nuclear fit into the wider electricity sector? What's it for? Having nuclear as part of your energy mix it's a choice, and it's a choice that some countries make and some countries don't. And understanding why does the country want a nuclear power station is really essential. What does it do to the bills? How does it fit in? How can you make the most benefit from a very large investment for consumers and taxpayers? And having a real empathy with how communities who are living near large long-term construction sites are really likely to feel, which is something I'll talk about a bit later. But I think those issues around people, which also go to bankability, because investors deciding to invest in nuclear, lenders deciding to lend, Of course, that comes with lots and lots of technical characteristics. Can they see an acceptable risk-reward ratio, whether as a lender or as a potential equity investor? But also, investors and lenders are people, and they have to want to do it.
That's really fascinating, and I think the key thing that I picked up right from the start is that you trained in English, so you learned English, and you were going from an English degree right across to talking about something as complex as nuclear power, alongside with what's going on with how that impacts people. So this career history of yours, well, what is that one thing in your history, in your career history, or even in your educational history, that you think has most influenced you to this position here?
I'm very interested in people and social justice. So I see building nuclear providing large, centrally distributed electricity at the same price to everybody. I see that as being a public good, along with it taking up very little room. So I felt strongly that nuclear could be very good for people in the UK as part of the UK's energy mix. And I felt additionally that when building something like Sizewell C, which is happening at the expense of consumers, it's very important to do it with the most social benefit that is consistent with the efficient delivery of the power station.
Brilliant, fantastic. That's insightful indeed. And we should definitely spend quite a bit of time talking about Sizewell C, including explaining to our audience what Sizewell C even is. But I'm just looking at the ream of experiences that you not only had, but currently have, including being the chair of a Repower initiative and even the commissioner for DESNZ. So Julia, tell us a little bit about each of the roles that you yourself currently have, what those businesses are, and then let's focus a little bit first on the Clean Power Initiative, and then we'll go on to talking about Sizewell C. So tell us a little bit of all the various roles that you have now.
So I'm the chair of Agilia Infrastructure Partners, which is a consultancy which both gives advice about infrastructure and has a lot of very experienced people from the world of infrastructure who've come together to help infrastructure projects go along better. Particularly at the moment, there's a focus on income models in the water sector, in the energy sector, and it also provides team members. And when industries like water, like electricity, and indeed airports, were privatised, the government established economic regulators. So the economic regulator for electricity is Ofgem. The economic regulator for water is Ofwat. That's under development, and it will end up in a new system, but currently it's Ofwat. The economic regulator for airports is the Civil Aviation Authority, the CAA. So these bodies are charged with making sure that services which are essentially monopolies, particularly obviously water and electricity, you don't have a choice about whether or not you pay your electricity bill. You don't have a choice about whether or not you pay your water bill. The economic regulator is charged with ensuring that consumers are offered value for money by the utilities.
So tell us more about the other roles that you have.
So I'm a Clean Power Commissioner. The chair is Chris Stark, who is appointed by the government for that role and has done a fantastic job. The Clean Power Commissioners are supporting the government by considering and giving advice on the path to clean power by 2030 and how that can best be achieved without unacceptable rises in bills, and how to get there. So it considers a range of issues about how best to get there.
Now that's not where your roles end. Tell us a little bit about all the other roles, and then we'll end on Sizewell C and do an in-depth on Sizewell C.
So my other roles, I'm a non-executive director for Studsvig. Studsvig provides technical services in the nuclear industry. For people in the UK, it's a little bit like what was called Barnwood, so the safety case and and sort of niche technical expert team, which supported old British Energy and then in EDF's ownership, the fleet of existing nuclear power stations and supporting the Hinkley and Sizewell being built. But in Sweden, they were fully privatized and it's actually NASDAQ listed. And Studsvik is looking at building new nuclear in Sweden because Sweden has a pro-new nuclear policy, and it has offered some fairly clear support to incoming potential investors and developers. And Studsvik has a large nuclear licensed site where it undertakes a lot of testing. It has hot cells, etc. And Studsvik has recently acquired new nuclear development capability. So it's an exciting time, both for Studsvik and in the Swedish nuclear industry. So I find that very interesting. And then I agreed to chair Repower, which is a not-for-profit organisation set up by Baroness Bryony Worthington and Staffan Qvist. And for anyone who doesn't know Staffan's book, A Bright Future, I really strongly suggest you read it. It's the case for nuclear. It's very clearly communicated. And it's that book which Oliver Stone made into his film about nuclear a couple of years ago. And the Repower is set up in order to provide advice about the conversion of old coal power stations to be repowered by clean electricity. So sometimes nuclear, not always nuclear. But the idea is to repower existing sites which already have a grid. So they sort of take away the need for huge amounts of new grid and have them turned into clean power.
So brilliant. And I think this is a clear example of how we need to start looking at the energy infrastructure space as being interrelated, different technologies providing the different benefits across the needs. In particular now with the demand for energy specifically and exponentially increasing. Hopefully we'll get a chance to pick up on AI. We've talked quite a bit about Sizewell C. Now let's get into it. What exactly is Sizewell C, Julia? Tell us a little bit about it from a description, from a technical description, and what your role was in developing Sizewell C.
So started rebuilding nuclear for the first time in a generation with Hinkley C, which is a 3.2 gigawatt nuclear power station in Somerset. By design, it's a pressurized water reactor. It's an EDF design. It's known as the EPR, which confusingly doesn't really stand for anything. But there are arguments about whether or not the E stands for evolutionary or European, but the PR is pressurized reactor. So once Hinkley was underway, it was decided to start looking at building a second in the fleet. And the UK historically had identified 8 sites in the UK for the building of new nuclear, only a few of which are actually suitable for gigawatt, big new nuclear. And one of those sites is Sizewell C, which is on the east coast of the UK. It's on the Suffolk coast, and it's next to Sizewell A, which was built, I think, in the 60s, which is an old Magnox reactor, which is being decommissioned by the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. And then next door to Sizewell A is Sizewell B, which for anybody who goes on holiday to the Suffolk coast, you can see the sort of big white golf ball dome if you sort of look down the coast from Aldborough. And that turned on in 1995. At the moment, there are negotiations going on for a life extension, so it will run for hopefully 85, which is when its original life would expire. And Sizewell B belongs to EDF as to 80% and Centrica as to 20%. And then Sizewell C, 8 years ago, was an awful lot of field next door to Sizewell B. But actually, quite a lot of the field, quite a lot of the site where Sizewell C is being built is the old laydown area for when Sizewell B was built. So quite a lot of hard standing. It had obviously grassed over in the years between. But Sizewell C was the chosen site for the next in a revival of nuclear in the UK. And so the planning for Sizewell C started more than 10 years ago. But the project really got impetus around 7-8 years ago. So when I started, Sizewell C was an idea. There was sort of planning ongoing, but there was little confidence it would actually happen. At that time, the government was talking to, I think, GE Hitachi about a power station on Anglesey at Wilver, where they're now building the Rolls-Royce small modular reactors. And Sizewell C, the power station which EDF was very clear from the start it would not be willing to finance on its balance sheet. So it's important for a Bankable podcast that to be understood that Hinkley is on the EDF balance sheet and it is financed out of EDF funds and CGN, China General Nuclear, who owned 33.5%. But Sizewell wouldn't be. And so right from the start, which is actually very helpful, we knew that Sizewell C would need to find a way of raising money from other parties. And I say it was very helpful because quite often, if it's not understood right at the start of a project that you need to raise your money from third parties, and if you want to raise any significant debt, you need a rating from the credit rating agencies. You must establish your project in a way which will support that. And that means you establish your project and you contract in ways which are very different from the ways in which you would contract if it were destined to be a exclusively on balance sheet project, not involving third parties. It's not to say that one is better than the other, but if you need to borrow large quantities of money and you need external investment, it's very helpful to set up your project in a way designed to attract the appropriate rating, to attract the lenders that you need, and to attract the equity that you need. So one of the first decisions...
I was just going to say, to concur with you on that in particular, because with a rating, you then have someone else scrutinizing the plan, your books, exactly, so to say, so that as an investor, even as a pension fund or an infrastructure fund, or even just a bank, you could say, well, it's not just the Sizewell C folk that are saying so, it's someone else.
Definitely, and yeah, the rating, we went to all three rating agencies. We went to Moody's, to Fitch, and to Standard & Poor's, and got a rating from each of them. And it was a very rigorous process. It went on for a long time, and it definitely shaped how we established the project and its contracts. So I'm a strong advocate of in your end is your beginning. If you want to end with large quantities of debt, you need to begin by establishing a project which is capable of attracting large quantities of debt. So then we moved the project forward through the question, would we build this with a contract for difference, or did we actually need to move away from a contract for difference? In the UK, there had been obviously Hinkley developed under a contract for difference. In fact, the contract for difference regime was initially designed for Hinkley. But we had seen that other nuclear power projects had not been able to be brought forward under a contract for difference regime. So we'd seen various iterations of projects up in Cumbria collapse because they couldn't attract confidence in investment with the CFD regime. And we'd seen the GE Hitachi project at Wilver on Anglesey collapse again because the contract for difference won't support new nuclear build, or certainly would not at that point support new nuclear build.
That's right. And I will make sure to put a link in this conversation to explain what a CFD or contract for difference is. And naturally, we've seen the CFD work successfully for offshore wind, for example, in the UK and in various other countries abroad. So you're right to highlight how it has worked elsewhere, but perhaps not necessarily for this particular project that was considered. Brilliant, thank you. So when the CFD wasn't chosen, tell us more about the instrument that became so-called Bankable.
So we started talking to the government about using a regulated asset-based model, which is the model used for national grid building transmission lines. It's used for water companies. It would be used for water companies building new infrastructure like reservoirs, retreatment plants, etc. And helpfully, the Thames Tideway Tunnel had sort of blazed the trail by adapting a regulated asset-based model, which generally had applied to a whole utility. So in the case of National Grid, to all of Grid's existing operations and new lines it's building, but to adapt it to just the new tunnel. So it was sort of spun out of the Thames Water's regulated asset-based company into being its own specific regulated asset base, the construction.
And we can do a whole webinar on what the regulated asset base model is, but in a very quick summary, what is the RAB?
The RAB is a way of consumers paying through construction for an asset which is being built, and then once it's turned on, then it's economically regulated, i.e. if it's electricity, then Ofgem; if it's water, currently Ofwat, etc., will reset the return every 5 years according to well understood rules. What it means for a project in construction like the Thames Tideway Tunnel or like Sizewell C is that there is some income through the construction phase. It can be very difficult for lenders and some forms of equity, particularly pension funds, if there is no return until something is turned on, where in the case of a nuclear power station, it's a long construction period.
Basically, the construction period for a nuclear plant is, say, 10 years, versus, say, the risk that other energy infrastructure take, for example, an offshore wind, where it's far shorter. But would that be a fair description of the difference?
It would be, and it's a reason why the contract for difference regime has worked very well, as you say, for offshore wind. So we talked to the government, and as I say, helpfully, the National Audit Office themselves had recommended that the government look at a regulated asset base for future nuclear projects after Hinkley. So the government introduced legislation. The legislation was passed through Parliament. And then we spent a long time discussing with the government whether or not the Sizewell C should be funded by private sector equity or public sector equity, and about the extent to which we were going to bring in external debt. Over the period of developing the project, that we sort of ranged from no public sector money to all public sector money, and various views in between, and where we ended up was with a majority of private sector money in the equity, a big slug of public sector equity, and we ended up with ratings, investment grade ratings, and with around about 5 billion of debt from banks and a lot of lending by the National Wealth Fund. And those were policy decisions by the government. It was not that Sizewell couldn't have raised the money privately. It's that the government chose to have a large proportion of the capital, and the government chose that National Wealth Fund lent a lot of the debt.
That's right. No, brilliant. And naturally, there are going to be lessons learned from creating this sort of a financial construction. What do you think is the key lesson learned from the RAB model in Sizewell C, Thames Tideway, which can now be taken to the larger infrastructure projects that are being developed elsewhere in the UK, perhaps in the rest of the world, and whether it's nuclear or not?
I think you need to decide, preferably quite early, whose capital is going to build this asset. And if you want the capital to come from, for example, pension funds, we've seen more in the press over the last couple of weeks about the government's desire for pension funds to put more capital into UK infrastructure, then you need to look at what do those investor types need. And one of the things they need is a return during the construction period, where it's a very long construction period. So they can wait through a short construction period, but for a long construction period, you need something which will pay income in construction. And the contract for difference doesn't, and the regulated asset base does. So I think your first decision is whose capital is going to build this? Whose capital do you want to use? And then once you've understood what are the necessary return characteristics for your class of capital, pension funds, bearing in mind that pension funds' duty is to be able to pay their pensioners, then sort of start discussing the appropriate risk allocation with that in mind, which is that if you want pension fund capital, they need income in construction. There is a risk allocation which can work for them, the risk allocation which will go too far. And so finding that right balance between making sure that the equity is appropriately incentivized to govern the project well, to do everything they can to keep it to time and to cost, but that you haven't gone so far in attempting to transfer risk that you have simply made it uninvestable or put the price of the capital up to a point which is actually not efficient for consumers.
Brilliant. And that word risk, now from a financing perspective, all sorts of connotations and all sorts of permutations to that word risk, but specifically for nuclear. Julia, tell us what sort of risk there is in terms of even having a nuclear power plant in your backyard. Should I be concerned that I do have a plant next door to me or in the vicinity of my home? What's your view there?
The principal risk in building nuclear power stations is of cost overrun. I mean, it's a risk which is common to a lot of UK infrastructure for reasons we could talk about, I'm sure, for many weeks, continuous weeks of podcasts. But in terms of an operating nuclear power station, it is one of the safest ways of making electricity at scale. And according to sources like Our World in Data, the safest statistically. And that is because the nuclear industry is very, very safety conscious. And so there are far fewer incidents like falling at height from for the nuclear industry than there are for example, the wind and solar industries. So even though people will think that wind and solar are safer, statistically, they're not, because of the issues with, in particular, falls from height. That's not to suggest wind and solar are not safe, but it is to say that the nuclear industry has an excellent safety record. That doesn't take away people's fear of the well-known history of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl and Fukushima are the three which are cited. Chernobyl, of course, is a terrible tragedy, and we are fairly close to the anniversary of that happening in, I think, 1986.
We just had the 40th commemoration.
We just had the 40th commemoration,
didn't we? Yeah.
But statistically, it is very safe. The other two, so that was it. That was the terrible thing that happened with nuclear. The other two incidents, 3 Mile Island, I don't think there were any injuries or deaths, and Fukushima, there are I think there's a dispute about a handful of deaths which are directly caused, and then there are, of course, consequences, terrible consequences for people of being displaced from their homes, and so there is sort of an uptick in deaths from displacement rather than from anything really related to radiation. It's sort of the fear of radiation. So I think it's a very complicated topic where people fear it in a way which is it must just be somewhere deep within people. People on the one hand would say they fear radiation, on the other hand they very happily go for an X-ray, very happily pop into the dentist for an X-ray, let alone if they break a leg, happily fly long haul, which will give you a larger radiation dose than working in a nuclear power station for a year, happily use microwaves. So there's something which the industry needs to think about even more about communicating about radiation, where the word itself seems to evoke fear, even though it is a commonplace feature of people's lives. It's a really you can see that as the need for nuclear is more recognised and it revives, and in the US it's reviving, and they're even looking at reviving the 3 Mile Island reactor, not the one which was shut down, but the one which carried on making electricity. So you can see that fear is sort of dissipating in the face of the undoubted need. But I think the nuclear industry mustn't be complacent and think that there isn't a sort of underlying concern about nuclear, which is one of the reasons that the cost of it tends to be higher than it should be.
Right, indeed. And we're now starting to see more interest in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, primarily because of that demand versus supply with electricity, isn't it? And perhaps just the last bit on the timing of risk, the question always comes up with nuclear waste. How did you address that when it came to dealing with Sizewell C's nuclear waste?
So nuclear makes waste, as does any way of making electricity. So, or indeed many things. It's petrochemical waste. There's waste from many things we do. Not to mention our own, the nation filling the landfills with useless plastic. But nuclear does make waste. It doesn't make much of it. So it's important to be understood that it's a small issue volumetrically. If you use nuclear electricity for the whole of your life, the uranium used to power the whole of your and your family's life in the UK for the whole of your lifetime would fit into a Coke can. So it's volumetrically small, and it's important to say that it is dealt with very safely. So there are no known issues of nuclear waste harming anybody. So it is dealt with very safely. There are plenty of issues with waste from many other product types, very actively harming people, children in parts of the developing world. Dealing with dumped waste from the Western world is a very unattractive aspect of the way we live our lives. But nuclear waste has never harmed anybody. So literally what happens with the waste is that it's taken out of the reactor after it's been used for the right amount of time, and it is encased. It's put in a pond to cool down for some months, and then it's encased in metal and concrete, and it sits completely inert in what's called a dry waste store, which is a lightly engineered shed. In the US, they leave these dry waste casks just outside in the open air. So if you wanted to go and visit Sizewell B and you wanted to see what happens with nuclear waste, you can go into the dry waste store. You can see these large casks, which are probably about as high as the ceiling of the room I'm sitting in at the moment. And if you wanted to, you could hug the cask. It's not emitting any radiation. It's completely safely contained. And it's a very calming thing to do, because I think then people can see the difference between what might be in their heads, which is sort of Simpsons-esque ponds of green glowing goo with Homer in charge, and they can see what it actually is a very calm, very inert, safe, very heavily concreted way of keeping the waste there while the heat decays.
Right. We'll have to start a new motion of hug a cask. In this case, not a wine, but nuclear waste. Now, interesting. Now, and one of the things in terms from a financing perspective is that the decommissioning of the plant, the handling of the waste is often and usually always addressed right at the start of the project level.
Yeah.
Is that the message that you would have seen and would encourage?
Yeah, no, definitely. People do need to appreciate that the cost of nuclear electricity includes the cost of decommissioning and waste disposal, and nuclear electricity is unique in that. So the price of global warming is not priced into the cost of fossil fuels. The price of decommissioning and disposing of wind turbine blades, solar panels, etc., is not priced into that electricity.
Right, very, very fascinating. We briefly spoke about AI. It's difficult these days to have a conversation without talking about artificial intelligence as it exponentially influences our lives. It also means that it's also requiring exponentially larger amounts of electricity. Now,
and water.
And water and cooling solutions, indeed. So, Julia, how are you, the various commissions and businesses that you chair and lead, how are you contributing towards decarbonisation, the advancement of AI, and what we have yet to speak about, energy security?
Well, AI is very much a double-edged issue, isn't it? Because it can, hugely improve efficiency of various processes, and there's obviously a very high demand to see how can it advance human life. But on the other hand, people fear the consequences, in particular for young people, of job losses which are speculated, and people don't know at the moment how to provide the electricity and water, and increasingly in drier parts of the UK, electricity and water have a close relationship, because parts of the UK are moving towards needing retreatment plants and desalination, both of which are uses of electricity. So in some ways, electricity and water in drier parts of the UK need to be seen together in combination. So the businesses use AI. It can be a very useful tool. It needs to be there's no one's going to pay you for advice which is delivered by AI. They can just ask AI. So the question for businesses like Agilia is making sure that people are able to use AI as for example, a research tool, but that what people are really paying for is the human analysis and judgment of the situation. And also, I think it will increase the emphasis on relationship skills. Lots of things happen in this world, not necessarily because they are right. They happen because of human relationships, people reaching understandings, people negotiating, and those things are human qualities. So I think it will emphasize the need to make sure that young people are able to use AI. They sort of generationally will be. They'll be generationally much more able to do so than older generations, but that the human qualities it requires in order to use it with judgment, in order to retain sort of human control of relationships, is needs to be emphasized in the way that we train people. And I think that we need to always bear in mind sort of much talked of issues around the mental health of young people in the UK, which is that we sort of face young people now with a combination of fear of climate change, an awful lot of pressure, very difficult housing market for young people, very little optimism about owning homes, and now we sort of add to that fear of AI taking their jobs. So I think there's a real duty on people of my generation to train and hand things over, and give more agency to young people who are not otherwise, especially if young people spend an awful lot of time sort of sitting at home working in their bedrooms. It's very difficult for them to feel the sense of agency and sort of optimism about their ability to make a good life for themselves that I would have felt when I was their age.
Right. I think the irony of the word agency here is that these days, when you think about an agent, you're thinking about an AI agent to do what a young person would have done. When you and I first started out at work, you get sent to the back room to do some research. Would take some time, but allow you to build up your skills as you become more senior in your role. Now, I think in particular that angle towards young people, tell us more about the opportunities despite the challenges that are available within energy infrastructure and within nuclear in particular, and where your view is on what they can look forward to.
Well, nuclear is possibly the most able to create large numbers of jobs directly in constructing and then operating nuclear power stations, because they are more people intensive, certainly gigawatt nuclear power stations. There are jobs of really almost all natures. So in a big nuclear power station project, there are obviously jobs in engineering, there are jobs in planning, there are jobs in nature recovery. So anybody building anything has a biodiversity net gain target, and in the case of Sizewell, we created large nature reserves. So there's a whole team of people who work on restoring quite monocultural land to much better biodiversity. We have people in all of those functions you'd imagine, like HR, looking after people. We have lawyers, we have people who work in finance, we have people who sort of monitor the large number of covenants for the banks. We have people who work in managing supply chain contracts. We have people who work in occupational health. We have people who would work in the reception and catering teams for the large numbers of people who will live and work near the site. And we have people who work in sort of workforce welfare, so above and beyond occupational health, you know, how do you keep. And one of the things that I am proud of is that amongst the many other things, including in particular getting Sizewell to happen and raising the money, we formed something called Sizewell Creative, which has an artist in residence and has people providing music, so that people who are in the workforce, who are away from home, or people who are in London can go and participate as a way of sort of having a break, getting to know each other. But also it's a way of communicating between the project and its local communities, where nuclear power station projects, you know, they exist behind barbed wire, they can be seen as quite remote, but through starting the workforce choir, we've sung at things like the local town's VE Day, Remembrance Day. So we're able just to be present and be part of the community. And I think that is a great way. I think the arts are a great way to communicate between different groups of people.
That's really incredible, Julia, that you've drawn that breadth of opportunity, not just for a nuclear technician or a scientist, but right across the spectrum to the needs of the welfare of the staff, to now the creativity that the staff has an opportunity to be part of. So this gives us lessons learned, not that it's just about the electricity generation or the heat at some stage that we should talk about, but that there is more to it. Now, is this replicated, and can it be replicated in other parts of the world? You know, as people look towards the UK in terms of developing Sizewell C, we also should mention briefly about the ONR and its role. Perhaps if you could just briefly talk about the ONR, perhaps briefly on the GDA, you know, just to pull it all together in terms of all the various angles in building a nuclear facility.
Sure. So if you wake up one day and you say, I want to build a nuclear power station, what do you need? Well, you need a site, and you need a site on which it is permitted to build nuclear. So that will mean, amongst other things, it has to have the right seismic qualities, because you don't want to build nuclear power stations over earthquake faults. And you need to choose your design. So what do you want to build? Do you want to build big gigawatt power station? Do you want to build a small modular reactor, or several? Do you want to build advanced modular? Do you want to wait for fusion? All of these things are in various stages of development. Whichever you want to build, it needs to be licensed by the Office for Nuclear Regulation, which is the UK's safety regulator, analogous to the NRC in the United States, And all countries which build nuclear will have a nuclear safety regulator. So they will assess the design, and there's a process you referred to, GDA, which is the generic design assessment. So generically, does this design look as though it's compliant with the safety requirements of the UK, which are rightly stringent? But then you have to, the ONR will then issue findings, and you have to make sure that those findings, that the safety requirements are built out as you actually build your power station in reality on your particular site. You also need planning consent, so that's like development consent order. That's from the local council to say you're allowed to build, and the conditions under which you build, which will tend to involve putting in some new infrastructure around roads, maybe railways. How are you going to get your materials to your site, especially where nuclear is built in remote places which don't have an adequate road rail infrastructure? And there will be environmental permits designed to protect the environment from the consequences of building. And then having got all of your consents, while getting your consents, you need to understand what is the workforce you need, because you will need consent to bring that number of people into what is probably a remote area. You have to understand where you're going to house people. You have to understand how are people going to be offered an acceptable time when not at work on the site, where workforce welfare, occupational health, the creative stuff I was talking about, sports. It's where all of these things come into it. You know, your big construction projects are often asking people to live away from home for a long time. The construction industry has one of the poorer mental health records amongst its staff, which is, I imagine, in some ways connected to living away from home. And probably you will need to, or in any event wish to, commit to having a proportion of your workforce come from the local area. So I think there's a need to, of course, focus hugely on actual skills training, but there's a need also for long-term projects to focus on the years before skills, making sure that the kids are both qualified and motivated to come into the skills training and then the industry.
And so what are the lessons learned that other nations or other geographies that want to develop nuclear can take away from the experiences that you have just shared?
Well, I think the first lesson other countries could have is to look at France and think, don't we wish we had an electricity system like theirs, which is dominated by nuclear? It's clean, and France has some of the lower electricity prices in Europe. It's never easy to do direct comparisons, but still, France today would look to us like quite an enviable electricity system, which is doing a lot of exporting to us, to Germany, to lots of countries around Europe who haven't either built out or maintained their nuclear sectors in the way that France has. I think the second is that I think deciding how much you want and deciding to take a fleet building approach is beneficial for all sorts of reasons. Partly in the literal building, you have people who are skilled building something who are inevitably, because it's a human characteristic to learn by doing, going to be better at doing it the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh time. When you see nuclear power stations which have actually sort of got cheaper as they have been being built, it has been when there has been that fleet approach to building, and everybody's known there's going to be a fleet. And that also enables countries to decide how much of the industry of manufacturing and construction do they want to have domestically? What's their priority? Is there a priority to have the cheapest power station and look at the contribution that the cheaper power makes to jobs elsewhere in the economy? Or do they have a priority of having a revived domestic manufacturing? And that's a decision which needs to be made early. You can't start building a power station and then say, oh, I really wish that we could have had the reactor pressure vessel forged in Sheffield. If that's what you want to do, you need to take that decision here. I mean, you know, one of the unfortunate things about industrial strategy is it doesn't take instant effect. So I think early decisions which are then consistent between administrations can only be good for everybody.
One theme that keeps coming through our conversation on what makes nuclear energy infrastructure bankable is communication between and across industries. It's not just between one facility, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the challenges and the benefits are open for all. So that's thank you for drawing all that through. So maybe two last questions. What is it that makes everything that you work on bankable for investors and lenders? Or, why should equity investors, debt lenders come and look at the future nuclear projects that are out there? So that's the first bankability side of it. And what makes you, Julia, in terms of your career bankable, so that we can grow a new world of Julias out there?
In terms of the first, once nuclear power stations are built, they are great assets. They carry on reliably providing power. They have an excellent record of availability, of longevity. The issues with them have tended to be political, but even those are in the minority. And so, although of course we saw the example of Germany, on the whole, even where administrations have decided to exit nuclear power or to dial it down, they tend to want to return to it because once built, these are fantastic assets which can provide enormous quantities of clean electricity from a small land area. So I think that if you take a medium-term view, they are in reality politically stable, other than in the peculiar circumstances of Germany, and they are extremely physically reliable. And they're also doing a good thing. So they fit very well with commitments investors may have towards sustainability, but also towards social benefit, because they're good employers and they tend to have high domestic content. They're good taxpayers. In terms of, I mean, of course, for them to be investable, they have to be put into an investable model. And that needs to be considered right at the start and driven through the whole way that the project is set up, so that the risks and rewards are of a nature which particular types of capital can buy into. In terms of how do you have more people who want to do the sort of thing I do? I did an event a couple of weeks ago with Professor Tony Travers at the LSE, which was about how more people with social sciences should go into infrastructure projects, social sciences backgrounds.
How intriguing. So that's almost a conundrum, isn't it, typically? Social sciences and infrastructure and technical skills. Tell us more.
Well, this is not to in any way decry the need for large numbers of highly skilled, qualified people in all the necessary technical disciplines for building a piece of infrastructure. But it is to say that often infrastructure suffers from a lack of clarity about questions like, what is it really for? And then there are questions around the sort of adversarial approach which can emerge between infrastructure projects and the surrounding communities. That's expensive, and it's also really unhelpful to social cohesion. If people feel put upon, people are not going to be happy, and that also, it doesn't just impact things like numbers of judicial reviews, delays to projects, the cost of fear of judicial review driving a sort of over process compliance inside the projects, which is the hidden cost of undertaking infrastructure. We need as a society to think about what is a reasonable social contract between people who live near infrastructure and the reward that they're given. The planning system focuses very much on mitigation. So I'd be saying to you, hey, great news, Doreen, we're building something near your house and we're going to run 10,000 lorries past your front door. But we're going to mitigate it because we're going to give you double glazing. You don't end up thinking, great, I've got double glazing and lorries, you end up feeling marginally less cross than you might otherwise have felt. And I think we need to start thinking about how communities which suffer the disruption of very long infrastructure builds, we need to start thinking about how that they benefit. One of the things I'm doing post Sizewell C is setting up a community interest company designed to work closely with the local council, and which I hope will be funded by not just Sizewell C, but some of the other energy companies in particular who are building in East Suffolk, focusing on consistent improvements to the environment. You know, people who live in East Suffolk went to live there partly because it's an area of outstanding natural beauty. If 5 energy companies come along saying, great news, we're going to put quite a lot of concrete and wire in your area of outstanding natural beauty, I think there's an imperative on us, because we're all doing this for the environment. It's clean power. But if you live near an environment which now has concrete in it, which used not to have concrete in it, you need to do something. And the thing that Sizewell did is to create nature reserves which are publicly accessible. And I think the more people and projects can join up to create much more coherent, larger, visible benefit. Here's the concrete, but here's the larger area of visible, accessible, high quality, biodiverse nature reserve. I think that's good. And I think that people care a lot about the quality of education in their area. We tend to build a lot of the clean energy infrastructure in remote coastal locations, which tend to have worse educational outcomes. And so the kids are less able to take up the job opportunities that arise. So I think supporting schools to really support them in helping the kids get better results in maths and science and English, and also help the schools reintroduce creative subjects again, can also see that in ways that matter to them, the environment, opportunities for their kids, life is actually better than it would be absent the infrastructure. And so we move away from this concept of pure mitigation. And what I'm talking about doesn't really involve huge amounts of money. It really involves being better coordinated and more thoughtful.
Incredible. So that coordination, and I think that the most intriguing thing that's come out in this last section of our conversation is about how there is a need for creativity, social sciences, in the advancement of technical fields, such as the development of a nuclear plant. So effectively, what we're saying to everyone is that you could say, I'm part of, say, Sizewell C or the next nuclear facility because I do the gardening, because I'm the receptionist, because I'm teaching people how to sing and write again. How brilliant.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Last words, anything that we may have missed that you really want the audience to hear?
I think, returning to the title of your podcast, I'd say, if you want your infrastructure to be bankable, think about it right from the start and set it up to be bankable, and be realistic about what is bankable, because that way it will all happen much more quickly. And the best way to drive down the cost of capital is to make sure you have plenty of people wanting to lend or wanting to invest. And that is what will ultimately result in best value for consumers.
Maybe you want to give a shout out. I just saw that you're also a patron of something called Combat to Coffee. Tell us briefly.
Yeah, Combat to Coffee is a fantastic organisation. So it was set up by a guy called Nigel Seaman, who is ex-military and who saw that there's a need for organisations to positively support people leaving the military, particularly if they have PTSD. So he supports people in 2 ways: by employing people, and by employing them in a way which is conscious of their background and what they need in order to enable them to thrive in the work environment. And he has a tagline, which is much more than a tagline, about spill the beans. So if people go and buy a coffee from one of Nigel's coffee outlets, then there is somebody there who's going to be available to have a chat to somebody, a customer who's got a particular worry, needs a chat with somebody. It's a way of sort of enabling conversation. and he's recently started extending his works to add to people who've been in the military, people who are being released from the justice system, because again, people need to be helped back into society and offered a listening ear, because that's going to be better for them and safer for all of us when people are supported back into a productive life in the community.
Brilliant, fantastic. Julia, it's been such a pleasure having you and listening to, I would surmise that it's just the tip of the iceberg of your knowledge. So we'll have many more conversations to be had. And yeah, looking forward to hearing more from you. Thank you for listening to Bankable. For early access to energy transition pioneers and to learn how to structure the investment solutions described in this episode and throughout the series, subscribe to the podcast and get in contact at Fresco CleanTech Solutions.